Hello, everyone, and welcome on in to our Week 7 college football preview. If you're watching this on video, the two other big brains, Ryan Coyle and Mark Henry Jr., are in full-on depressed mode because we're recording this right after NLDS Game 4. I am Joe Tanzi. I am not the depressed one because my team decided to not even make an effort in the wild card round. But we're here to talk college football, the biggest weekend of college football yet. And I'm sure these two very chipper gentlemen with me will be able to give you everything you need in terms of bets for Ohio State, Oregon, Penn State, USC, Ole Miss, LSU, the Red River Shootout. It's still the shootout. It's not the Red River rivalry between Texas and Oklahoma. The best Saturday yet in college football. But before we get to that, guys, the most chaotic Saturday of college football we had last week. What do you make of all the upsets and how does it affect everything with the college football playoff, if it does at all?
I think the biggest thing is, and I think we've touched on it a few times so far this season. I know Kirby talked about it this offseason mostly. He was saying basically with the transfer portal and NIL and everything that we've discussed over and over again, the depth and the quality of rosters has changed. Like the ceiling of Georgia, the ceiling of an Alabama, the ceiling of Ohio State, and so on, isn't as great as it was 5-10 years ago because teams aren't just stacking 4 and 5-star guys anymore. If those guys aren't playing in year one, let alone year two, those guys are out the door, going to get money paid somewhere else and going to get immediate playing time. The floors of a school like a Vanderbilt have raised. And I'm not saying that Vanderbilt now will be competing for SEC titles or anything, but maybe they're competing for consistent bowl eligibility instead of 1 to 2 wins a season. And they showed that on Saturday. Like it wasn't like it was a fluke, like a 13-10 where Alabama threw 7 picks, got 2 field goal blocks, and Vanderbilt wins on a walk-off 65-yarder. No, Vanderbilt had their way. They put up 40-plus points on Alabama. And A.J. McCarron, I heard him say it this week, Vanderbilt kept it simple. They were running the same play. They ran it to the right, they ran it to the left, and they whooped Alabama up front at the line of scrimmage. And, you know, in the past, that stuff doesn't happen because you have just guy after guy after guy. Now, if your top 3, your top 4 aren't producing, you don't have the next guy to turn to. So that's one of the biggest things. And I said it on Monday. I was like, just buckle up because we're still only halfway through the regular season. You're going to have a lot more of these weekends to come in. You know, the playoff picture is just getting wilder and wilder. Like there's a path now where Texas Tech, Syracuse, and Indiana could be in the college football playoff. And that just makes it crazier and crazier by the week.
So here's the question I'll pose to you, Mark. Was there really chaos in terms of the college football playoff? Because you look at Missouri, who completely underperformed in the first place this season. You have a team in Alabama who has a win over Georgia in the bank. Tennessee still has to play Georgia and Alabama. If they win one of those games, we're essentially putting them in. How do you kind of look at the SEC and the playoff picture right now, and does it change much, if at all, because of where those two teams specifically? I think Mizzou is definitely way on the outside, but how Bama and Tennessee are right now.
I mean, yeah, it takes away your margin for kind of mess up, your margin for error here. My brain is not firing on all cylinders. I'll be quite honest, but I couldn't find that term. But I would say that, yeah, Alabama, Tennessee now, I don't know if it becomes an elimination game because that's definitely not the case. Either team could get in with 2 losses. But the team that loses that game is not going to be in a great spot. And we'll get to that later. I have a little bit of a take about this week in college football compared to some upcoming weeks that I think might be a hot take out there. But I think that you look at those teams and it eliminates their margin for error. Does it get them out of the college football race? No, but you look at a team like Ole Miss, and if they're able to get the job done this week, their schedule shapes up a lot more favorably with kind of how their earlier season mess up went against Kentucky than an Alabama's could or than a Tennessee's could.
So when we look at the rest of the picture here, because so many losses happened, there are teams that have drugged themselves back into contention. We're talking about Clemson, talking about Notre Dame, maybe a second team from the Big 12, depending on how those things shake out. But we're looking at the bottom half of this, so the bottom third, really, maybe the 10 to 12 area or 9 to 11 area, because we're assuming 12 is the G5 team. How does this kind of, I guess, change the motivations for a Clemson, for a Notre Dame, for maybe a K-State of sorts, where now all of a sudden you're one loss in the SEC away from really being in this conversation for good?
You keep saying Notre Dame, you mean Army, right? When Army goes 12-0.
Well, they'll be the G5 team.
Well, hey, they might be the 1 seed. They beat Notre Dame. You go 12-0. You beat Navy and Army Navy. I don't know. It is funny. Bud Elliott, I'm sure Beef saw it, put out his college football playoff prediction. He actually had Boise State as the 4 seed, and he said that the Big 12, I think it was Iowa State. He ranked Iowa State as like the 7 or 8. So I don't even know how that works. I thought that the 4 main conference teams were guaranteed. Was he just trolling there?
Yeah, it is the 4 at large team, or the 4 champions.
The G5 can get it. It's if Boise's just say Boise's 9 and Iowa State wins the Big 12 at 10, Boise would go.
Okay. That's
so
awesome.
they're guaranteed. Yeah, I mean they're guaranteed a spot, but it's not penciled in. In fact, that it's just ACC, SEC, Big 10, Big 12.
That would be awesome if Boise State could be the 4 seed and get a bye and go make a Big 12 team. I think the Big 12 championship, the Big 12 champion could have 2 or 3 losses, and we'll get to Iowa State this week. But yeah, I don't. There's a good chance that they're ranked pretty low.
So we have 3 conferences that we've mentioned. We haven't mentioned the Big 10 yet, and I think in terms of significant shifts in the playoff, I think the Big 10 went through the most drastic one in week 6, because Michigan and USC both now have 2 losses. So you have a clear top 3 in Ohio State, Oregon, and Penn State. And then Michigan and USC are really fighting for their lives here. And Michigan's schedule isn't very good. And USC could very well lose to Penn State at home this weekend and be completely out of the playoff picture, Beef. I mean, what do you make of the Big 10 now? It feels like we just have 3 teams, and no matter what happens this weekend with Ohio State and Oregon, it feels like those teams are getting in.
Yeah, USC is starting to revert to what I thought about them at preseason, where it was like they're just not ready to play in the Big 10 roster-wise. And I thought once they got into Big 10 play, hell, I even thought the first game against LSU would kind of expose that. But that was still my main takeaway coming out of that LSU game with USC. It was like, all right, sure, they tackled, but now you're seeing 4 or 5 weeks into the season, the willingness to tackle decreases. Like once you get those bumps and bruises, do you really want to level that shoulder in and make that key play? So, USC was up there, Michigan last week, as we talked about with the Washington game. Going into that game, Michigan was minus 1,600 to miss the playoffs, plus 800 to make it, and they were number 10 in the country. Really goes to show you kind of what Vegas thought about their prospects. So now you're kind of just down to Ohio State, Oregon, and Penn State. But if Penn State goes to USC, shoots himself in the foot this weekend, Penn State, then suddenly that becomes must win against Ohio State coming up. Oregon, Ohio State, you see in that scenario as well. But I think we're going to see 2 teams out of the Big 10, potentially 3. But a lot of these guys still got to play each other. So that's kind of the main question in that regard.
So let's get right into it. The game of the week, potentially the game of the season. Alabama, Georgia obviously has something to say about that in terms of how it played out. But at least going in, you have number 2 versus number 3. Ohio State at Oregon. I'll put this stat out there. Now, look, there's a little asterisk because Ohio State hasn't traveled yet. Penn State hasn't traveled yet. And I don't believe Oregon has traveled this either. But teams that have traveled 2+ time zones, whether it be West or East in the Big 10, are 1-7 straight up so far. That includes Michigan at Washington last week, USC at Minnesota, UCLA, although not as much in the spotlight, the same at Penn State last week. That's a concerning trend. Now, I think some of that also has to do with who the teams that suffered those losses are. But it at least is notable that travel in the Big Ten has affected a lot of teams so far. Now, I don't think that will apply here. I think, at least in my opinion, the better defense is what's going to apply here in Ohio State. But when you look at this game, I'll start with you, Mark. Ohio State and Oregon. What do you think is the difference maker in this game?
I don't think Dylan Gabriel's good enough to beat Ohio State. And I know that sounds funny because I don't know if Will Howard is, an incredible quarterback. They're probably, I don't know if I would take Will Howard over Gabriel, but I don't think they're on a different level than each other. I think they're on a similar tier of college quarterback. Uh, Shane Half, a guy who I do another podcast with, he's an Oklahoma fan. He's kind of been on the Dylan Gabriel's a bit of a screen merchant ever since he was playing at Oklahoma. So I feel like I didn't watch him as closely at Oklahoma as I'm watching him at Oregon. And now that you watch him, there really is a lot to be desired when it comes to taking shots down the field and it comes to kind of extending plays. And it really does feel like he's a bit of a system guy and he's kind of just throwing in the flat, checking down all the time. And I get that his yardage totals get pretty crazy. I think he's been pretty disappointing so far this year. And I know that the stats would tell you otherwise. But I'm starting to think he's a bit of a college quarterback stat merchant. That's not the only reason I'm taking Ohio State. You look at a lot of the stats, and I like Dan Lanning. Dan Lanning's a really good coach. I feel like Dan Lanning has been crowned a bit as, I don't know about the next up or the next guy or, the next premier coach in college football. What's the last big game Dan Lanning has won at Oregon? I'm posing that to both of you. You go look at the schedule last year. What I looked at didn't have a team that finished ranked on it in terms of their wins. In 2022, they beat a UCLA team that was ranked 9 at one point at home. They didn't finish the year ranked. They had 4 losses. They also beat a Utah team that was ranked 10. They also finished that year with 4 losses. That was in a 2022 season that Oregon went 10-3. So I feel like Dan Lanning got a lot of credit for maybe beating a pretty bad schedule last year and losing the 2 games that mattered against Kalen DeBoer and Michael Penix. And now we're turning around this year and we're expecting him to win this big game against Ohio State. I don't know what big game he's won to prove to me that I should be backing Oregon in this spot.
Yeah, when I look at this matchup, I'm siding with you there, Mark. With Gabriel has been disappointing, I think, to an extent where it's like he needs everything working with him to make it work. And last week he had, lucky he was playing Michigan State. He had 2 brutal turnovers in the red zone where he was trying to make he was trying to make throws that he just doesn't have the talent and the arm strength to make. And you do that against a team like Ohio State that comes back to bite you. At the same time, when I look at Ohio State, though, Iowa last week, okay, Iowa's Iowa. They'll probably still go 8-4, 9-3. But outside of that, Michigan State, Marshall, Western Michigan, Akron, have we really seen this Ohio State team tested yet? Now they have to go to Eugene, where I feel like Oregon doesn't get hyped up as a good enough crowd nationally, just because most of those games are night games out there, 10:30 and whatnot. But that is from a testament of analysts have gone across the country to these games. They say that's a top 5 to top 10 atmosphere in college football. So you're not walking into an easy atmosphere at all. And this is by far the toughest game you played. Oregon's going to be juiced up. But for Oregon or for Ohio State to be it's now a 3-point favorite, I believe. I think it opened up at 4. For them to be that big of a favorite on the road, I think just goes to show you how much they believe in the Buckeyes. So I'm siding with the Buckeyes here. I do think Will Howard, too, has a lot more to work with at his disposal than Dylan Gabriel as well. And the defense is more legit. I think the defense gives the Oregon offensive line troubles, which has had a lot of trouble early in the season. So I'm going to side with Ohio State here, but definitely a first major test for Ohio State. I think Oregon's had a tough couple more games than Ohio State has to start the year.
Yeah,
I'll keep it simple. Defense travels. Like, plain and simple. Like, you're right about Dylan Gabriel. You have a great point about Dan Lanning, but I think when it comes down to this matchup in this season, Ohio State's defense, we have a big enough sample size now where it's been consistently not just good but great, like top in the country in a lot of categories. It's not just one thing they're good at; they're good at everything. And I think we forgot a little bit because everything crashed down so bad offensively at the end of last season, especially in the bowl game. All their defensive studs came back. You still have Tui Molau. You still have a loaded front seven. Caleb Downs gets added to that group. I think in terms of just matchup alone, I mean, look, Ohio State's got all the studs on defense that can make Dylan Gabriel's life hell. And if you mentioned those 2 red zone interceptions against Michigan State, if you're making those mistakes against Michigan State, 1 or 2 are probably prone to come about against Ohio State. And that's concerning for me when I look across the board here at what the strengths and weaknesses are of both teams. Look, I'm not saying Will Howard is a elite quarterback. I don't think you can say that yet. But the pieces he has around them with Judkins and Henderson in the rush game, and Jeremiah Smith is coming into his own at receiver. And oh, by the way, we've talked so much about Jeremiah Smith and coming in. Emeka Egbuka is still there, one of the longest tenured receivers in the country. So I think you have the pieces around him at Ohio State that sets him up far more for success than Dylan Gabriel does at Oregon. And I also think that the defense is just playing out of its mind right now, where it's so hard for me, even with the home field advantage that Oregon has, to even put trust into the Oregon Ducks, because Ohio State, I mean, everything across the board defensively has been stellar. So let's move on.
You mentioned the guy. You mentioned the guys there with Tuimalu and there's Sawyer and Williams and Burke and Downs on defense. I just don't know if Oregon has kind of the NFL talent at all that Ohio State has. And, I fell for this with Georgia, Alabama, and, I underrated the home field advantage, and I've been wrong on everything this year. So probably fade what I'm saying. But you look at Ohio State and you mentioned the defense, and I just wanted to throw this in there. Part of how good the defense is outside of all the NFL names I just mentioned, the guys that are going to get taken in round 1 or round 2, is that Chip Kelly has the running game. I mean, and, it's not just Chip Kelly. It's also having studs like Quinshon Judkins and Travion Henderson and a quarterback who can run like Will Howard. But that's complementary football, and they're keeping the ball on the ground, keeping the defense off the field so that they're fresh when they get back on the field. Chip Kelly's not running his crazy tempo offense all the time necessarily. So he's an incredible kind of designer when it comes to running the football. I think when it comes to these big games, what they're going to be able to design up with Judkins and Henderson, maybe even out of the same backfield sometimes, is going to be crazy.
Yeah, and I think that we haven't talked much about them because they haven't played in many big games, but I mean they manhandled Iowa last week. Even watching just a quarter of that game, they were all over them and pouncing on them. And look, if the number's at 3 right now, I'll gladly take that. I think that's a pretty easy number for me to latch in on. And hell, I'd probably take them as much as high as a touchdown. Like, I'm not confident in how their defense is playing. And to me, that's the X factor. Forget the quarterback play, forget all the studs on offense. If that defense is playing it the way it is, it's gonna be hard for anybody to stop Ohio State this season.
Yeah, I'm on Ohio State as well.
Plain and simple. Let's move on to the other matchup in the Big Ten. No longer a top 25 matchup because USC fell flat at Minnesota last week, which I think some people saw coming, but it's still a pretty surprising result. And now you have Penn State going out to USC as a pretty overwhelming favorite. James Franklin is doing his best, I guess, to try and not talk about the game and complain about the travel. Maybe that holds any credence because of how the record is right now, but cool, you're flying out of Harrisburg instead of State College. Whoop-de-doo. I think your college athletes can handle that quite well because the plane, I assume, is going to be very cushy and nice that they're going to fly on with reclined seats and everything. They're a 5-point favorite against USC. Everything we've seen from both of these teams doesn't give you a single reason to bet on USC in this game. I mean, let's be honest. Penn State's just a machine in these types of games. Could it be better? Sure, but they're not. You take the UCLA game for example last week. They didn't blow them out of the water in the first half, but they made all the plays defensively. Eventually, the offense got going, and they ended up winning big. I think it was something like 27-11 or something like that. But UCLA scored a very late touchdown to make it remotely, I guess, respectable. So, I mean, this to me is very straightforward. If you're giving me James Franklin in this situation, not against a top 10 team anymore, very important to note. I think it's a pretty easy bet to make. Beef, what do you think on Penn State USC?
Yeah, I'll go right to the camera there with some beef up front. I think that's a major difference in this game. I think that's a major difference of why USC is going to need a couple years to kind of make this roster and make it into a bully squad, not a track squad. We know track squads aren't going to fly in the Big Ten. You look at Penn State on both sides of the ball, line of scrimmage, they're going to be able to manhandle, I think, this USC team. And I think last week, I'm pretty sure we all were on Penn State last week with the -27 against UCLA, thinking that they would just roll in that one, probably keeping it pretty vanilla in that game. I think this is a game against USC on the road where you kind of really fully unveil the playbook. Nick Singleton didn't even play last week. I think they just kind of wanted to get through that game and be fully focused going into this one because USC still a much more talented team. We've also seen Miller Moss regress, I think, since that first LSU game, kind of come back to this is why you were the guy that was sitting on the bench for 3-4 years. And you got your chance still. I think USC will be fine, 8-4, something like that. But I really like Penn State in this game. You talked about it a bunch before, especially going into that West Virginia game, that James Franklin kind of thrives in these spots. Not a top 10 team, a favorite of less than a touchdown. This is where a spot that he should dominate. So I like Penn State to win in this one, and I think that they win pretty comfortably. And a statement game. Like I feel like Penn State still hasn't gotten that national type buzz. I feel like Tennessee was a team that was getting so much buzz. Penn State's been doing pretty much the same damn thing, and they played some better teams as well. So Penn State, I think, can really put themselves in the driver's seat this week for they're going to be, as long as they hang on and win this game, they're going to be at least number 3 in the country because you got to figure the loser of that Oregon versus Ohio State game is dropping below them.
Yeah, absolutely. And they're a very quiet number 4. It's very difficult to say that sometimes, but Penn State is a very quiet number 4. They're just going about their business right now, beating the teams they should beat. With the West Virginia game, a lot of people thought that would have been a slip-up spot. It wasn't. Heck, the toughest test they've gotten was from Bowling Green in week 2, right? And that was just more of a shootout than anything. So I think in this game is where Kotelnicki, the new offensive coordinator, ends up being the difference maker. Maybe there's a more creative offense. Drew Aller's allowed to throw the ball deeper. You get a few of those 20, 30-yard pass plays that end up making the difference on top of just grinding it out. And look, I said defense travels. I think that's true with Penn State as well. Their defense is phenomenal. And I think we'll see the same exact thing in terms of defensive domination out of Penn State that we will with Ohio State.
Yeah, I'm on Penn State as well. I mean, you saw Michigan and obviously Minnesota punch USC in the mouth, and I think Penn State is just a much better version of both of those teams. So I think Penn State's going to do the exact same thing, except do it by a lot more points,
with far better running backs too.
Exactly.
A running back tandem that I think you could make an argument it's the most underrated in all of college football.
Probably the second best.
Yeah.
Honestly, I'll take Jonty and Beef as a running back duo over maybe anybody in the country. Or maybe I'll say Jonty and Tansy.
You don't want me running the ball.
We're giving it to Ashton every time anyway. We're just saying duo
exactly
to make it a combo. But no, I mean, after Judkins and Travion, I don't think anybody has a second back like Katron Allen.
Yeah, it really is fascinating to see. Texas and Oklahoma, the Red River rivalry. It's the Red River Shootout. Like, let's be honest. I mean, we can't call it that technically, but that's what it is. It's the Red River Shootout. Texas and Oklahoma. Oklahoma's dominated this rivalry. If you look at the trajectory of these teams, right, and these programs, you don't exactly think Oklahoma's been the dominant side in Red River, but they have. So now you look at a team in Oklahoma, freshman quarterback, nothing seems to be going right. They barely beat Auburn 2 weeks ago. Texas, by all accounts, is going back to Quinn Ewers. They're a 14-point favorite. Everything is going in their favor. If this means Texas is cruising, right?
Yeah, my main kind of take on this one, and I think once I'm settled on it, Texas, I'm gonna have winning the game. I'm not sure what I'm gonna take with the spread yet. The biggest thing for me in this matchup is I was looking at last year's box score because I remember I had Oklahoma spread in that one. I want to say it was like a 7-point spread. They wound up winning that game outright, obviously. Dylan Gabriel rushed for a little over 100 yards in that game. And what does Michael Hawkins do? Well, he's not a great thrower of the football right now, but he is able to use his legs. So if they're able to kind of scheme up some similar stuff or just get Hawkins moving out of the pocket, Gabriel gave Texas a lot of fits last year with his legs. So if Oklahoma is able to do that, they could pose some problems. And Quinn Ewers coming off an injury, coming off 2 weeks of no game play, and then plus a bye week. Does he come out a little rusty as well? Maybe the angle in this game is look at an Oklahoma plus the points in the first quarter, plus the points in the first half. Maybe get them early and Texas kind of takes over in the second half. Definitely think Texas is a much better team. I'm a much bigger fan of them going forward over the long haul. We know how I'm not a fan of this Oklahoma squad, but that's just something that's been in the back of my mind a little bit. Hawkins potentially causing some problem with his legs, and maybe making things a little bit interesting with Ewers coming off some rust.
I'm taking the over in this game. Look, the Red River is just a knockout, drag out brawl. That's really, it always seems to be chaotic. There always seems to be points in this game. I think Texas does win, but I think you're right, Beef. I think that also the angle to look into in this one is a potentially Texas live line, maybe somewhere around like the second quarter, depending on does Quinn Ewers look a little rusty after a few weeks on the shelf? Can Oklahoma with Hawkins with an athletic quarterback get the ball downfield, maybe put points on the board first? I think that's a way to look at it. I think Texas does win this game, but I'd feel more confident in there being points. I think Oklahoma can be feisty. I don't think they can win, maybe cover, but I think it's a rivalry game. I think they will be at least a little bit feisty in this one.
9 of the last 11 meetings decided by 8 or fewer. It's always a chaotic game, and I feel like most of the time comes down to the wire. But I think this is the first time, at least in recent memory, that you can point to the rosters and see a significant gap between the talent in Texas being, a much better squad than Oklahoma.
I'm not touching this one from a gambling standpoint, but part of why I think this week has kind of become a little bit overrated, to be honest, is because USC and Oklahoma didn't live up to their end of the bargain of making this week.
That's fair.
Cool. And maybe I'm wrong. Maybe both underdogs win outright, or one of those guys win outright, and it makes me look stupid for saying that. But having said that, it makes me have to think at this point, where if Lincoln Riley looks in the mirror and the Oklahoma Sooner fans, who probably hate Lincoln Riley's guts more than anybody on the planet, look in the mirror, they wouldn't you don't think both of them would turn back the clock and maybe make a different decision a couple of years ago? I think both sides, maybe Oklahoma forks over a little bit more money and Lincoln Riley stays instead of going. I think you're probably better off on both sides.
Yeah, it really is fascinating to see how those two programs kind of really haven't gotten to where they wanted to be, right? So it is I don't know if you can call it sliding doors because neither of them have been excellent, but yeah, it's definitely go ahead.
It's the same with Brian Kelly at the same time. Like Notre Dame and LSU is kind of the same situation. Like you're kind of looking at sliding doors, both both jobs that switched time. They switched around the same time.
And what a way to slide into the last big game of the week.
There you go.
Ole Miss and LSU. I think another game that's lost its luster a little bit because of Ole Miss's loss to Kentucky. Look, Ole Miss has gotten back up to number 9, but without all of the losses that happened last week, they might not be, right? Because Missouri, Michigan, and USC were all ahead of them going into week 6. So to me, that's a little fascinating that Ole Miss is number 9, and it feels like, I don't want to say it's a cheap number 9, but it almost feels that way, right? Because they got punched in the face by Kentucky. They went back and beat South Carolina, but I think we're still trying to figure out here what the hell Kentucky and South Carolina are. I think Kentucky's a tough team, but you have that loss to South Carolina and it just completely baffles you, right? So it's one of those that messes with your head. LSU, not really a lot to write home about either. You have the loss to USC, and then they've been scoring points. I think that's the positive. They scored 34 or more in every game. They held South Alabama to 10. They held UCLA to 17 in their last 2 games. How much credence you put in those results, I don't really know because they're weaker opponents. Ole Miss can certainly move the ball. Beef, talk me through this one. How does Ole Miss LSU end up playing out?
I locked in the over for this one at the beginning of the week. It's the only college bet that I have in so far, but I locked in over 64. I feel like this is a game that gets bet up to like 67 or something. I just can't get last year's 55 to 49 game out of my head. And I know Jaden Daniels, Brian Thomas, Malik Neighbors, a lot of guys from that matchup are out the door, but you still got a lot of the same coaching staffs in that game. So I really think we get a lot of points in this one. I'm just a little bit surprised, and I know LSU hasn't played a lot of people yet, but I'm a little surprised. I feel like they haven't been really discussed at all. I know they lost the USC game, as you touched on, and their notable wins, South Carolina, UCLA, they haven't really played anyone, but they're still sitting there.
That's why they're not being discussed yet.
Yeah, they're still sitting at 13 in the country, and they're at home in this one. I feel like this is a top 5 college football atmosphere. This is a night game as well. Yeah, it's a 7:30 game as well.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like that's one of the cardinal sins, betting against LSU at home at night. So I think 3.5, that's a big number, but that's also all right, is Ole Miss, is Vegas screaming at you to take Ole Miss in that one? It's a real interesting game for me. I think I'm just going to ride because I have Ole Miss over 9.5 wins on the year. I think I might just stick with that on the side and just ride with the over. I think it's a fun game, a shootout, and you're playing in the 40s, and you see kind of last team that has the ball wins.
This is a fun game to have on the second TV while you're watching Ohio State, Oregon, and you turn around and oh, somebody just scored another touchdown. I think that's how this game goes. I think Ole Miss potentially is actually soft. TBD on that one. I'm going to stick a feather in that. I think
they are. I think you're right.
I think LSU is very live in this game at home. It's a big opportunity for them. And look, as much as we don't want to lump LSU into the playoff conversation, they win this game. They're going into the top 10. Now, the back end of the schedule, okay, going to Arkansas, rivalry game, a game that typically is Black Friday or used to be in the past. So that's a big game for Arkansas. There's a letdown sandwich spot, you name it, because they play A&M the following week. So they're going to run through a gauntlet starting on Saturday with Ole Miss at Arkansas, at A&M, and then Bama at home for what is usually the night game in Baton Rouge. It's tough one to go through. So I don't know if I want to say crown them into a playoff with a spot with a win, but they'll certainly get themselves into the conversation if they do. And I think they're live.
They're in the conversation now. I'm going with Ole Miss, and I think it's just a matchup thing where LSU has given up the most big-time plays this season. And then you look at the other side of the ball, Ole Miss has the most big-time plays in the country with rushes over 10 or receptions over 20. And they have 84 of them, which is 9 more than the next. with Miami coming in second place in that. I just think that they're going to be able to make big plays. And Kentucky did a good job limiting that. Ole Miss was able to pile up yards, and they still the numbers still look pretty from that game, but they made them do it slowly and kind of go down the field methodically, kind of like like the Fangio style is what that was kind of what they did, where they beat you on 15 play drives. Where Ole Miss wants to beat you deep, and I think that's what they're going to do. No Harold Perkins. I do think Ole Miss is soft. I totally agree with that. And I think that there's going to be matchups down the road that take advantage of that. But with no Harold Perkins now for LSU, which I do think is a big deal in this matchup, I think that this is kind of where Ole Miss's finesse is able to show in a matchup against a bad defense, as opposed to down the stretch when they play a little bit more legitimate defenses.
I think the over is a fantastic play in this one, by the way.
I'm in on it, yeah.
I think both teams are going to go up and down the field. You see a lot of great quarterback play. And like I said, if Ohio State, Oregon is kind of a slugfest, like it could be, this is a fun alternative to have. We need to find a game, though, where the three of us are not aligned, because it feels like at pretty much every
LSU
game.
A little there, right?
Yeah, but we're all on the over. We're all on the over. It's just I feel like we need to disagree. There's too much agreement going on here. With that being said, let's talk real quick about the teams that lost last week and bouncing back, because that's always.
I'm betting them all.
There you go.
I'm betting them all bounce back.
So you have Alabama at home against South Carolina, a 21-point favorite, still at 21 there. Mizzou at UMass. It's weird, but I actually feel bad for UMass now, because it could look really, really bad. And then is Michigan off, or are they playing somebody? I forgot Michigan on this list.
I don't know, but I'm on Tennessee as well. I
That's right. We have Tennessee.
Tennessee minus 14.5 against Florida. That's the only one of those group that I like. The other numbers are just so big, and I hate betting big numbers. But I mean, even the Tennessee number is pretty big there at 14.5. I think people are riding a little high on Florida. Man, this UCF team that I thought could be a sleeper absolutely stinks.
Two straight stinkers in a row.
And Vegas is sitting there holding the bag, because 2 weeks in a row, Vegas gave that UCF team probably way too much, or obviously way too much respect. And Florida, that game was over in the first quarter. You just saw an athlete difference. I don't think you're going to see that against Tennessee. And Beef and I were texting about it. I've been really disappointed in Heupel. I think Heupel's done a terrible job this year. I think he's really been a coward with Nico. The way that he's coached Nico has been so, especially the last couple of weeks. I said it, that Oklahoma game, they won. I walked out of that Tennessee-Oklahoma, which should have been a big win, feeling way worse about Tennessee and way worse about Heupel. And then, they lay the egg last week. So I guess I don't know why this anti-Heupel and anti-Tennessee tirade from me is going to tell you to bet Tennessee this week. But I do think that this is a bounce-back spot. And I think that Florida is feeling good now, finally, for the first time this year, probably. And I think this is where Tennessee's kind of getting them at the right spot.
On the flip side of those results, Vanderbilt is a 13.5-point dog against Kentucky. I'm going to make the assumption that when we see the betting splits on Saturday, Vanderbilt is the most popular underdog because of what they've done this season, not just against Bama, but Diego Pavia led them to a win against Virginia Tech at home. I'm betting Kentucky in this game, and pretty confidently.
Yeah, Kentucky minus 13.5, Bama minus 21.5. Tennessee minus 15.5, and I'm taking Tennessee first half. Heupel is the best first half against a spread coach in college football history, like percentage wise. I think this is, when I was talking with Mark, we said my main point with Tennessee was that 2022 team was fun. It was you just wanted to watch them because you knew that they were going up and down. And it feels like this year, he talked about it at SEC Media Day, and defense is pretty damn good. I mean, they weren't the reason why they lost last week, but he's like, when you think of Tennessee, I want you to think of defense. No, dude, you got this sweet quarterback, you got playmakers on the outside, and you have a sweet offensive system. Let's let loose and go score some points. I think this week might be the week where he's like, all right, screw it. We're going back to my old way, and we're going to put it on them. Maybe even look at team total. But yeah, I definitely love Kentucky this week. Vanderbilt has to fall flat. There's no way that they can possibly come out and trump what they did last week. And I think Bama, that it might have been felt better about it if Saban was there going into this game. I'll see how they bounce back after DeBoer, but you have to feel like there's a little bit of extra pressure on the gas this week in that game. And South Carolina, a lot of people were on them as a dog last week. Fall flat, disappointment against Ole Miss. It might be the wheels are kind of turning in the opposite direction there. So I like the teams in the bounce back spots, and then I like Vanderbilt to fall flat as well.
I want to hit on a few second tier games real quick. They're very clearly in the second tier, maybe in the third tier, but they're involving teams that are on this fringe of the college football playoff, and they're both in the Big 12. Iowa State at West Virginia at night in Morgantown. I've sat here for the last 2 weeks talking about Iowa State and really hyping up the Cyclones. I'm staying far away from this game. And then you have Kansas State going to Colorado, who all of a sudden is Colorado like half decent? Like, what do we make of them? Or is UCF that bad from a few weeks ago? Those two games in the Big 12, if not betting, they're just fascinating from a matchup perspective because Colorado and West Virginia could, in theory, make those games difficult and in turn flip the playoff, at least the Big 12 conversation on its head. Who knows what the Big 12 looks like, but those feel like two really important games, and they're two really short spreads as well.
Yeah, the West Virginia game is a no touch for me. I'm just staying away from that because West Virginia is just a funky team where it's like which squad shows up. First of all, Oklahoma State, maybe the biggest whiff this season. What a terrible start to the year for them.
So bad.
Does that just mean Oklahoma State sucks even more that West Virginia game last week? But I do really like
K-State. I think they still suck.
Yeah. But I on the K-State Colorado game, I really like K-State this week. I think that it's kind of a coming back to earth game potentially for Colorado in that one. But Colorado, who knows? Maybe they're kind of playing with a chip on their shoulder, and at this point, they're playing some pretty good football. But you got to think that we win 2 weeks ago or whatever it was against Baylor. You need a Hail Mary to beat Baylor, who has been terrible as well. How much of these wins are, they're good or it's just the opponents they're playing are weak. So I think K-State's a pretty good squad. And I think that right now you can look at them as a favorite of the Big 12. I think they take care of business against Colorado.
I want to put a few money in the crumbs type games like I do every week to end this. I'm just going to keep betting Army and fading UAB until the wheels fall off. And it just so happens Army plays UAB this week. I'm taking Army minus 26.5 against UAB. Army's a machine. Navy's a machine as well. And UAB is the Trent Dilfer thing is just not working out whatsoever. Another one that has my interest, Pitt minus 3.5 against Cal. Cal, emotional week, game day, somehow bundling that game against Miami at home. Now you got to go 3 time zones over against a Pitt team that is very quietly climbing up the rankings with a good offense as well. Eli Holstein leading that offense. I like them. And there was one other one on the board. Keep an eye out in the American. I know we talked about Army and Navy a lot, and Memphis has been in the discussion. North Texas can light up the scoreboard very easily as well. I have them at 6.5 at Florida Atlantic. I think that's going to be a very fun team to watch throughout the year. Be interesting to see how they play against the top teams. And another one I want to give a small bit of attention to. I don't think I'm going to bet it, but you know how we talked about at the start where Big Ten road teams traveling in multiple time zones? Add in a letdown spot there. Minnesota -5 at UCLA stinks to high heaven. If you're going to bet UCLA at any point of the season, this might be it, just because of the letdown, the travel, all of the above.
I'm betting Minnesota. I don't like it, but I'm betting it. It's an absolute yeah, everything tells you that you should bet UCLA. I just don't believe in UCLA whatsoever. So I'm taking Minnesota minus the 5. I didn't mention it earlier because I cut out, but I like West Virginia. I'm starting to talk myself in throughout the week. I didn't think I was going to play it all week. In the last couple of days, I've really talked myself in. Neil Brown is well above 500 against the spread as a dog. He actually has 18 outright wins as an underdog too. Just way better. He's a little bit Wilcox-esque when it comes to against the spread as a dog. So give me West Virginia there. It feels like every time we think that we've had the Big 12 figured out, we
We
don't.
don't.
So it feels like this is where that spot comes in. One question I want to ask you guys: the College of New Jersey, Rutgers with a big game this week against Wisconsin. I think Wisconsin stinks. I think that them keeping it close with USC was just what we have seen from USC now. Is that if you're at all a physical football team, that they're going to struggle in any way. Um, Rutgers is not going to be out physicaled here by Wisconsin with Greg Schiano chopping and chopping. So I like Rutgers a lot here against Wisconsin.
They're the State University of New Jersey. Get it right.
The State University of New Jersey.
The College of New Jersey is a whole different other college.
My
D3
friend,
baby.
yeah, TCNJ, yeah.
The Lions.
My great insomnia cookies near campus there, not far from my house at home. But
covered many a swim meet at TCNJ in my previous life.
Rutgers, Luke Carazola, who I went to high school with. He was a tight end at tight end and D end at Neshaminy. He went on to play at UConn. He's a tight end coach at Rutgers. So a good friend of mine growing up. I'm kind of got a soft spot in my heart for Rutgers. So keep chopping over there beef. Steve Peichel pounding nails, but I think I might be biased here. But I'm starting to talk myself into Rutgers as one of my best bets this weekend.
Speaking of the Big Ten, Purdue's awful. I would bet Illinois. I think that spread's moved all the way up to 22.5 now.
Purdue's so
But
bad.
Purdue got shellacked by Wisconsin, so that makes it kind of inflates what you think of Wisconsin. So I agree with your thought process there to Rutgers, but I think also to the point that Purdue is just very bad. Illinois, I know that's a kind of a rivalry game, Big Ten West, but I think Illinois just takes care of business there. That's not going to be a game.
Yeah, and you mentioned there that it's kind of like Wisconsin's inflated from losing or from beating a terrible Purdue team, and Rutgers is also deflated a little bit. I think people were
From
a
the
little bit
Washington
excited
game.
about Rutgers. Nebraska, they lost.
Oh, that's
By
right,
a
Nebraska.
touchdown.
I'm sorry. Yeah.
They lost by a touchdown in Nebraska, but they played great defense in that game, held Nebraska to 14 points. Raiola probably had his worst game so far there. So I think that the defense is legit there with Rutgers, and I think the offense will be able to do more here against Wisconsin than it was in Nebraska, especially at home.
Plenty of depth on the schedule besides the big games. All the big games will have plenty of our attention in week 7. For Mark Henry Jr., Ryan Beef Coyle, I'm Joe Tanzi. Come back next week. We'll recap all of the big games as well as preview week 8 and get a little more into the college football playoff now that we have a little more clarity after week 7. Best of luck on your bets, and we will talk to you guys next week.